The encounter. The night was unusually still in Haven's Rest, the kind of silence that seems unnatural, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. Daniel had grown used to the quiet, living in isolation for the past 2 years. He used to be an aerospace engineer, working on advanced space projects, but after a series of personal losses, he'd retreated into the woods, away from the chaos of the world, away from the noise. His cabin stood on the edge of a vast, dense forest, a place where the trees seemed to stretch to the heavens. On clear nights, the stars sparkled brightly above, and Daniel would spend hours at his rooftop telescope, searching for the one thing that still stirred a sense of wonder in him: space. That night, the stars were there, scattered like diamonds across the dark velvet sky. But then, something unusual happened. A strange blue light pierced through the dark, streaking across the sky like a comet, but slower, deliberate. The light flickered, dancing in the night air, and then, for a moment, it disappeared behind a tree line. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. His curiosity kicked in, overriding the isolation he had come to treasure. He grabbed his flashlight, tossed on his jacket, and made his way toward the woods. His boots crunched against the underbrush, the soft breeze rustling the leaves, as if nature itself was whispering secrets to him. The deeper he went into the forest, the more he felt an odd sensation creeping up his spine, as though someone, was watching him. But the feeling didn't stop him. It spurred him on, urging him to move faster, to follow the light, to discover what lay ahead. Minutes later, Daniel stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight casting long shadows over the ground. He stopped dead in his tracks. There, lying crumpled against a tree, was something, or rather, someone, he never could have imagined. A figure, tall and slender, with glowing silver skin that shimmered like the surface of a lake at dusk. Her hair cascaded around her face in waves of silver, glinting with an otherworldly luster. Her body seemed almost ethereal, as though the light from the stars themselves had gathered in her form. But it was her eyes, deep violet and filled with pain, that truly captured his attention. She looked human, yet not. Her features were delicate, her cheekbones high, and her lips parted slightly as if she had been about to speak. But the words never came. She was unconscious, and her breathing was shallow. Daniel hesitated. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to turn back, to return to his cabin and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But then he heard the faintest whisper, a single word that froze him in place. Help. The voice was soft, almost a murmur, but there was no mistaking the desperation in it. A surge of empathy washed over Daniel, and before he could stop himself, he was at her side, crouching down to inspect her. He checked her pulse, and to his relief, it was strong, though rapid. She was alive. "Hey," Daniel whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Her eyelids fluttered, and then her violet eyes met his. They were filled with fear, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite place. Her lips parted, and she tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Please, take me." She passed out again, and Daniel's heart raced. He didn't understand what was happening. Was she human? An alien? His mind spun with questions, but his instincts pushed him into action. He couldn't leave her here alone in the woods, vulnerable and defenseless. Without a second thought, he scooped her up in his arms. She was light, too light for someone who looked so delicate. There was an almost fragile quality to her, as though she might break if he wasn't careful. As he carried her back toward his cabin, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. The woods, silent only moments ago, seemed to close in on him now, as if the world itself was conspiring to keep him from this encounter. He didn't know who or what this woman was, but in that moment, none of it mattered. She needed help, and he was the only one there to give it. The walk back felt like an eternity, and Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. Could she be a survivor of some kind of crash? Maybe an escaped experiment. There were rumors, whispers of strange sightings and strange disappearances. But nothing like this. Nothing like her. When he reached his cabin, he carefully laid her on his bed, tucking a blanket around her. He paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on her face. She looked so vulnerable, so fragile. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to be beautiful. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck him. It was the mystery surrounding her, the unspoken story that hung between them. He couldn't explain it, but something deep inside him told him this moment was significant. As the night stretched on, Daniel sat beside her, his thoughts racing. His once solitary life now felt like it was on the edge of something incredible. But as he stared at her, watching her chest rise and fall with each shallow breath, one question echoed in his mind. Who was she? And why had she come to Earth? The answer was something he wouldn't have been prepared for, even if he had known it was coming. The journey ahead would force both of them to confront things they never thought possible. And in the end, it might just change everything. Secrets revealed. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Not that he ever had much of a chance, not with his mind buzzing from everything that had happened. The alien, or whatever she was, had awoken only once before passing out again, her body frail and unresponsive. He did his best to monitor her, ensuring she didn't slip into a deeper unconsciousness. As dawn crept over the horizon, he found himself sitting by her bedside, staring at her, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and wonder. She had to be something more than human. No human could look like her. Her skin, so smooth, so silver, it almost seemed to glow in the dim light of the room. Her features, delicate yet sharp, didn't belong to anything he'd ever seen. Daniel had worked on space exploration projects, studied alien technology, but nothing prepared him for this. Her eyelids fluttered open again, this time a bit more slowly, her gaze still clouded with pain and disorientation. Daniel leaned in, instinctively reaching for the glass of water on his bedside table. "Hey, take it easy. You've been out for a while," he said softly, gently lifting her head. She drank, her movements weak, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes when she met his gaze again, a sense of recognition, almost as if she knew him from somewhere. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse but strangely melodic. "I didn't mean to cause you trouble." Daniel shook his head. "No trouble. Just, don't scare me like that again." He smiled nervously, though his heart was still racing. "What happened? Who are you?" For a moment, her gaze dropped, and she closed her eyes as if gathering strength. Then she looked at him again, this time with a steadier focus. "I am Ayara," she said quietly, "a diplomat from the planet Thinari." Daniel froze, his mind struggling to process the words. "Wait, you're from space," he stammered, hardly able to believe it. "I mean, you're an alien." Ayara nodded, though there was a sadness in her eyes, like a shadow that wouldn't quite leave her. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to put it. Why are you here?" Daniel asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. Ayara took a deep breath, her violet eyes scanning the room. "I came to warn Earth. To warn you all about what's coming." Her gaze locked onto his with an intensity that sent a chill through him. "I failed. My mission went wrong. They found me." "Who?" Daniel pressed, his heart pounding as he stepped closer. "The ones who see humanity as a threat. A race too unpredictable, too emotional," she said, her voice thick with sorrow. "Your passion, your ability to fight for what you love, that's what terrifies them. It's what makes you dangerous." Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. Dangerous. The thought was almost laughable. Humanity. Dangerous. But as Ayara spoke, her words began to sink in. He had always believed that humanity's greatest strength lay in its resilience, its ability to rise from the ashes. But what if that very trait made them targets? He shook his head. "I don't get it. We've only just started exploring space. We're not even close to being a threat to anyone." His mind raced. Who are these people? And why come to Earth? Ayara lowered her gaze, her lips trembling slightly. We were once allies with a different race, the Zirethians. They saw your potential, your capacity for innovation and love, and they wanted to control it. They were the first to come to Earth, offering help and peace. But it wasn't peace they were after, it was control. And now, their enemies have come, not to help but to destroy. Destroy, Daniel repeated. You mean to wipe us out? Ayara met his eyes again, and for a brief moment, her gaze softened. Not exactly. They won't wipe you out, not completely. But they want to neutralize the threat you pose, and they will stop at nothing to do so. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. None of this made sense. He had seen his share of conspiracy theories, heard the whispers of secret organizations, but this was something else entirely. An alien race, a war brewing in the stars, and a woman, Ayara, caught in the middle. He couldn't deny the gravity of her words. Why help us? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. If your people are afraid of us, why warn us? Ayara hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a breath. Because I've seen what humanity is capable of. Not just your technology or your wars, but your heart. Your ability to love, truly love, despite everything. It's something the universe has yet to fully understand. I came here to help you, because I believe in you. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to say. For a moment, all he could do was stare at her, trying to understand the weight of her words. Ayara wasn't just some alien on a mission. She was someone who believed in humanity, someone who had risked everything to warn them. The quiet was broken by a faint hum outside. Ayara's eyes snapped to the window, her expression hardening. They'd found me. It's too late to hide, she whispered. Before Daniel could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door, followed by a voice, cold, mechanical, calling out from the outside. We know you're in there. Come out, and no one gets hurt. Ayara's face went pale, and she stood, her body tense with a sudden urgency. They've come for me. They won't stop until they've finished what they started. Daniel's pulse quickened. What do we do? Ayara's eyes met his with determination. We fight. We run. The chase. The hum of engines grew louder, creeping closer to the cabin. Ayara's face paled as she heard the unmistakable sound of hovercrafts above, their engines whining through the forest, cutting through the stillness of the night. She grabbed Daniel's arm urgently, her grip like iron despite her delicate appearance. They found us, she said, her voice tinged with panic. We don't have much time. We need to leave now, before they lock this place down. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He barely had time to process her words before a voice crackled over the cabin speaker system, its mechanical tone cold and unyielding. This is your final warning. Surrender the alien. You will not be harmed if you comply. Daniel's pulse raced. He didn't know who was out there or what they wanted, but something about Ayara's expression, the fear, the sense of urgency, told him they weren't here for a peaceful chat. Do you know who they are? Daniel asked, keeping his voice low as he moved quickly to the cabin's front door. He grabbed his jacket, his mind racing through the escape routes he'd mapped out in his head. He had a few places that might work, but he didn't know how far he could take Ayara before they were caught. Ayara's eyes darted around the room as she listened. They're not from my people. They're Zirethians, she said with a grim tone. They're dangerous. They want to eliminate all threats to their control. And right now, I'm their primary target. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He'd heard of the Zirethians before, distant allies of Earth, at least in name. But nothing had prepared him for the reality of facing one of their enemies. This wasn't just some minor skirmish, it was a war, and they were caught in the middle of it. We need to move. Now, Ayara urged, her voice shaking slightly. She was trying to stay calm, but even Daniel could tell she was barely holding it together. Her violet eyes, usually so full of quiet strength, were now clouded with fear. It hit him. She wasn't invincible. She was as human as he was in this moment, vulnerable and afraid. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back door. "Follow me," he said, as he opened the door just enough to peek out. The woods were still, but the sound of engines overhead told him they were closing in. He had to move quickly. Ayara followed him, her steps light and graceful as she moved with surprising agility, despite the weakness that still lingered from her crash. Daniel didn't dare look back, knowing every second counted. The trees ahead parted into a small, narrow path leading toward the mountain ridge. It was steep, and he knew it would slow them down, but it was the only way out. As they moved deeper into the forest, the hum of the hovercrafts grew more intense. Daniel glanced behind them for the first time, his eyes narrowing. He saw the searchlights sweeping over the forest floor, searching for any sign of movement. They were closing in. "We have to keep moving," Daniel urged, his voice tight with anxiety. He was doing his best to stay calm, but with every step, the pressure of the moment weighed heavier on him. Ayara looked at him, her golden eyes locking with his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never wanted to drag you into this." Daniel shook his head, his hand tightening around hers. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I'm here because I chose to be. We're in this together." They moved faster now, their pace quickening as the forest gave way to the base of the mountain. Daniel knew these trails well. He'd used them many times during his wilderness training. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. This time, it was about protecting the woman beside him and keeping them both alive. They reached the foot of the mountain, and Daniel hesitated for a moment. He could hear the Zirethians' hovercrafts circling overhead, the searchlights glinting through the trees. They were close, too close. "We're almost there," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper as he led Ayara up the narrow mountain path. "There's a hidden cave system up ahead. It'll give us cover." Ayara nodded, her face tense with fear. "How do you know about it?" "I mapped it out years ago," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. "There's a natural waterway through it. It'll disrupt their scanners." They moved in silence now, the air thick with tension as they navigated the rugged terrain. Each step brought them closer to the cave system, and Daniel's thoughts raced. They couldn't afford to be caught. The Zirethians weren't just powerful, they were relentless. The moment they reached the entrance of the cave, Daniel motioned for Ayara to stay close. He activated a small, homemade device he had kept for emergencies, an EMP that would temporarily knock out any nearby tech. A soft crackle followed by a brief silence told him it was working. As they entered the darkness of the cave, Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. The faint hum of hovercrafts above them faded into the distance, but they weren't out of danger yet. "This isn't over," Ayara said softly, her voice barely a whisper in the stillness of the cave. "They'll keep searching for us." Daniel nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "I know, but we're not giving up. Not now. Not ever." Ayara looked at him, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "I never thought I'd find someone like you on Earth." Daniel met her gaze, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" She smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Someone willing to risk everything. Someone who sees the world not for what it is, but for what it could be." Her words lingered in the air, and Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if they would even survive the next few hours. But one thing was certain. They had something neither of them had expected: hope. A moment of connection. The cave was a dark, silent refuge from the chaos outside. As Daniel and Ayara moved deeper into the narrow tunnel, the sound of their footsteps was muffled by the thick stone walls. The only light came from the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi scattered across the cave's ceiling, casting an eerie greenish hue over the jagged rocks. Daniel tried to ignore the sharp edges of the uneven terrain beneath his boots, focusing on getting them both deeper into the labyrinth of tunnels. His breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of their situation settling heavily on him. Ayara, though injured and exhausted, moved with a grace that seemed out of place in such an environment. Her skin, once dull from the crash and injuries, now shimmered faintly under the glow of the fungi. Her expression, however, remained tense, her golden eyes scanning every shadow, every curve in the path. It wasn't just fear she was hiding. It was a deep, pressing sadness that made her seem more distant than ever before. "Are we safe here?" Daniel asked, glancing over his shoulder as he led the way. The soft clatter of his boots against the cave floor echoed, but no other sounds followed. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath just like he had been. Ayara nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "For now, yes. But not for long," she murmured. "They will send teams to search the caves. They won't stop until they find us." Daniel exhaled slowly, pushing his frustration down. He had no answers for her, no comfort to offer. He wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't equipped to protect her from what lay ahead. His mind raced with the unrelenting pressure to stay ahead of their pursuers, to keep moving, to survive. But as they ventured deeper into the cave, something shifted within him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about her. It had been that way from the moment he found her in the woods, from the moment she'd opened her eyes and asked for help. Ayara stumbled slightly, and Daniel reached out instinctively, catching her arm to steady her. His touch was gentle, but her skin, warm under his fingers, seemed to send an unexpected jolt through him. She looked up at him then, her eyes wide, and for the briefest moment, the fear in them softened, replaced by something else. Something deeper, more vulnerable. The kind of connection that seemed impossible in the face of everything they were up against. She shook her head, a small, wistful smile playing on her lips. "I never thought I'd find someone like you on Earth, Daniel." Daniel blinked, surprised by her words. "Someone like me," he repeated, his voice hushed. They had only just met. He was just a man, one who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Nothing extraordinary about him. She nodded, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand him in a way she hadn't before. Someone who sees beyond fear. Someone who isn't afraid to act, to protect. "You're different." Daniel looked away, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't some hero, not in the traditional sense. But hearing her words, he didn't know why, but they made him feel something. Something more than just the adrenaline pushing him forward. Something that reached deeper into the space between them. His hand, still resting on her arm, felt warm, and he noticed, for the first time, how much smaller her body seemed next to his, how fragile she was. She wasn't some unbreakable alien warrior. She was a person, someone who needed help, someone who was just as human as he was, maybe more than he could understand. "We'll get through this," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know how, but we will. We'll survive this together." She didn't say anything for a moment. She only nodded, her gaze steady and unflinching as she watched him. Then, to his surprise, she reached up and placed her hand over his, the warmth of her fingers sending a strange electric current through him. Her touch was soft, yet somehow stronger than any words. "Thank you, Daniel," she whispered, "for everything. For believing in me." His heart raced again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the fear of being caught or hunted that stirred him. It was something more, something he couldn't quite place. The connection between them was undeniable, even in the darkness of the cave, even with the weight of the universe pressing down on them. There was a quiet understanding that they weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for each other. They sat down on a smooth rock, their backs against the cold stone wall of the cave. Ayara's body was still weak, her breathing shallow, but she seemed more at ease now, more present in the moment. Daniel could feel the tension in her body, the weight of the fear she'd been carrying since she arrived on Earth. But now, for the first time, it seemed as if that burden was shared. It wasn't just hers anymore. It was his too. Ayara closed her eyes for a moment, and Daniel didn't speak. He simply sat beside her, feeling the strange pull of her presence, the way the air seemed to shift when she was near. His thoughts drifted, wondering about the life she had left behind, what it was like to be from another world, to be so far from everything familiar. But then she spoke again, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I never wanted to be the one who brought this danger to Earth," she said, her words laced with guilt. "I never wanted to be a weapon, to be the one they hunted." Daniel looked at her, his brow furrowing. "You're not a weapon," he said firmly. "You're a person, and you're not responsible for their actions. The ones who want to hurt us, they're the ones at fault, not you." She met his gaze, and for the first time since he found her, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hope. Just a glimmer, but it was enough to make him believe. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed to hear that." Daniel smiled softly, his fingers brushing against hers again. For a brief moment, the world outside the cave, dark and dangerous, seemed so far away. All that mattered was the quiet warmth they shared, the strange connection that had bloomed between them. The fight wasn't over. The danger was still out there. But here, in this moment, they were just two people, sharing something no one else could understand. The sound of engines in the distance reminded them that time was running out. But as Daniel stood, offering her his hand to help her up, he felt something stir within him. A resolve, stronger than before. He wasn't just helping an alien. He was helping someone who had become more to him than he could have ever imagined. "We'll make it," Daniel said with quiet conviction. "We'll make it, Ayara. And when this is over, I won't let you leave without knowing that you're not alone." Ayara's eyes glistened with emotion as she took his hand, standing beside him, ready to face whatever came next. Together, humanity's spark. The cave was colder now, the warmth of their shared moment fading with the evening's approaching darkness. The air was thick with tension, and Daniel could feel the weight of time pressing down on them. They hadn't been found yet, but it wouldn't be long before the Zirethian forces increased their search. The low hum of their hovercrafts was a constant reminder that danger was closing in. Ayara had been quiet for the last few minutes, sitting against the cold cave wall, her golden eyes distant as she stared into the flickering light of the small fire Daniel had started. She had grown weaker, the exhaustion from the crash, and their constant flight catching up with her. Daniel could see the faint tremor in her hands, and it pained him. He knew her life was in its hands now. "We can't stay here forever," Daniel said, his voice rough with frustration. "We have to keep moving. If we don't, they'll find us." Ayara met his gaze, her face a mask of determination. "I know, but I can't run much farther like this. I need to rest." Daniel stepped closer, kneeling down beside her. "You need medical attention. I'm not sure how much longer you can hold out without it." Her smile was weak, but she appreciated the concern in his voice. "You've done more for me than I could ever ask, Daniel. I never imagined Earth could be like this. So full of life. And you." Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you. Someone willing to fight for me. Someone who believes in me." Daniel's heart raced again at her words. They had been through so much in the past few days. Running, hiding, fighting for their lives. And yet, in this moment, surrounded by danger, he felt closer to her than ever before. "I believe in you because I see you," he said quietly. "Not just as someone from another planet, but as someone who cares, who's willing to risk everything for what's right. That's not something I take lightly." Ayara's eyes softened, and for a moment, the coldness of the cave, the fear, and the uncertainty of their situation faded away. There was only the two of them, sharing something more than just a fight for survival. But then the sound of engines in the distance broke the moment, reminding them both of the reality they faced. Ayara's expression hardened as she pushed herself to her feet, wincing slightly as she stood. "We can't wait any longer. The Zirethians won't stop until they found me." Daniel helped her, steadying her as she struggled to maintain her balance. Then we run. Again. They moved quickly, following the narrow tunnels deeper into the cave system. The Zirethians weren't far behind, their search efforts growing more intense as the minutes passed. But Daniel's mind was no longer solely focused on evasion. There was something inside him that had ignited in the past few days, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The need to protect, to fight for what was right. Ayara glanced at him as they walked, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You're different now," she said, her voice low. "I can see it. You're not just running anymore. You're fighting for something." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He didn't know how to explain it. But as they moved through the darkened tunnels, his resolve grew. This wasn't just about saving Ayara anymore. It wasn't just about surviving. This was about humanity. His people. The ones who had been manipulated and controlled by the Zirethians, and the ones who still had a chance to fight back. "We are not weak," Daniel said finally, his voice steady. "We may not have the technology or the power the Zirethians have, but we have something they don't. We have heart. We have emotion. And we're not going down without a fight." Ayara looked at him, her golden eyes wide with something akin to awe. "You're right. They fear us because they can't understand us. They see only chaos in our emotions. But you're right. Our emotions are our strength. They make us unpredictable, and that's something they can't control." Daniel smiled at her, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar sense of hope. "Exactly. And that's what's going to get us through this. Humanity's spark. It's something they'll never be able to extinguish." They reached the end of the cave tunnel, and for the first time in days, Daniel allowed himself to pause and breathe. They were safe, for now. The Zirethians hadn't found them, and they were deep enough in the cave system that it would be hard to track them. "We can't keep running forever," Ayara said softly, her hand brushing against Daniel's. "Eventually, we'll have to face them." Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. "I know. And when we do, we'll fight. Together." Ayara looked at him, and this time, there was no fear in her eyes. Only determination. Together. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their journey ahead pressing on them. But in that moment, they weren't just two people running for their lives. They were a team, bound by a shared cause, and the hope that they could make a difference. The hope that humanity's heart, its strength, and its emotions could be their greatest weapon. And that hope, more than anything else, was what would carry them forward.